Welcome to Miss Marple Mystery. A Christmas letter arrives after midnight mass, and with it, murder. Secrets stir beneath the snow. What would you do if truth arrived too late? Where are you listening from? Tell us below. Snow fell softly upon the roofs of Mary Mead that Christmas Eve, blanketing the village in white silence, broken only by the tolling of the church bell. The air was crisp, scented faintly with pine and candle wax, as the last parishioners left Mary's after midnight mass. The flicker of lanterns glowed through the mist, and laughter muted by scarves, and breath floated briefly before vanishing into the cold. Among them was Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in her thick woolen coat, a small sprig of holly pinned near the collar. She had stayed behind a few minutes longer than the others, helping Mrs. Price Ridley gather hymn books. There was a serenity in her face, touched by the reflection of candlelight, though her blue eyes carried that faint, unyielding sharpness that made the inattentive nervous. She noticed everything, who slipped quietly away before the final hymn, who lingered near the church door whispering, and who avoided eye contact when the vicar spoke of forgiveness. By the time she stepped into the snow-covered lane, most villagers had gone home to their waiting fires. Only the vicar, Mr. Clement, stood near the lich gate, talking to the postmistress. Miss Emily Farrow, a tidy, anxious woman with frost-tipped spectacles and hands perpetually gloved, even indoors. Miss Marple greeted them both with her gentle warmth. "A beautiful service, Vicar," she said softly. "It does one good to be reminded of peace on earth, even when the world insists on being contrary." The vicar smiled. "Quite so, Miss Marple. And thank you for the flowers. They looked splendid on the altar." Emily Farrow gave a nervous glance down the lane. "I'd best be off, or the kettle will boil dry. Still, I thought it queer that someone insisted on posting a letter tonight on Christmas Eve, no less. I found it slip through the post office door when I returned from service. No stamp, mind you, just addressed to the vicarage." The vicar looked mildly puzzled. "To me?" Miss Farrow nodded, her breath visible in the cold. "I left it in your box. Thought perhaps it was from one of your parishioners who couldn't wait till morning." Miss Marple's brow furrowed faintly. "Delivered after midnight," she murmured. "That's rather deliberate, don't you think?" But Emily, eager to reach her warm kitchen, merely smiled and waved off the suggestion before disappearing into the snow. When Mr. Clement reached the vicarage a few minutes later, the house was dark except for the faint glow of the hearth. His wife, Griselda, had long gone to bed, leaving a note on the table reminding him to take his medicine and not to leave wet boots in the hall. Smiling fondly, he removed them, hung up his coat, and noticed the small envelope propped against the teapot. There was no return address, only his name written in a rushed, uneven hand. The paper smelled faintly of smoke. He hesitated, then tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper creased, stained, and written upon in the same hurried scrawl. The message was short. "By the time you read this, it will be too late. But you should know what happened at the old rectory on the night of the 19th. I can no longer live with the lie." There was no signature. Mr. Clement stood quite still for several seconds. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks into the air. Something deep and uneasy moved in his stomach. He folded the letter carefully, placed it inside a book of Christmas sermons, and stared at the flickering shadows on the wall. The next morning dawned pale and cold. Word spread quickly that something dreadful had occurred. At precisely 8 o'clock, young Tommy Leggett, the grocer's boy, found the postmistress's door ajar when he came to deliver milk. The little bell above the door tinkled as he entered, calling out cheerfully, then stopped mid-word. Miss Emily Farrow lay behind the counter, her spectacles broken, her tea spilled across the floor beside her. The back door was open. By 9 o'clock, the entire village knew. By 10, the police had arrived from Much Benham. And by 10:30, Miss Marple was quietly making her way to the post office, shawl drawn close against the cold, her eyes calm but searching. Inspector Craddock stood by the door, his moustache bristling as he gave instructions. He looked up when he saw her, and smiled faintly. "Good morning, Miss Marple. I might have known you'd be about." "I do like to keep busy, Inspector," she replied mildly, "and one can hardly ignore such excitement on Christmas morning. Poor Miss Farrow. Seems she slipped and struck her head on the counter edge. That's the current view, at least. Nothing stolen as far as we can tell." "Ah," Miss Marple murmured. "And the letter she mentioned to the vicar?" Craddock blinked. "You've heard about that?" She nodded gently. "I was there when she spoke of it. It's curious, don't you think? A letter without a stamp. Delivered after midnight, and now the sender perhaps afraid of being known." The inspector frowned thoughtfully. "You think it's connected?" "Oh, I dare say it might be," Miss Marple said. "In villages, things so seldom happen in isolation. Human beings, like ivy, tend to grow around one another's secrets." Craddock gave a wry chuckle. "You always have a way of putting things, Miss Marple." She smiled pleasantly. "Yes. I've always found that people underestimate a little old lady. It's most instructive." As she bent to straighten a fallen letter on the floor, her sharp eyes caught something others had missed: a faint footprint, half smudged in the melting snow that had drifted inside the doorway. It was small, precise, and oddly placed, turning inward, as though the person had been standing still, watching. Miss Marple straightened slowly, her expression thoughtful. "No, Inspector," she said quietly. "I don't believe poor Miss Farrow slipped at all." By the time the morning mist began to thin, Mary Mead was already abuzz with whispers and conjecture. Curtains twitched discreetly as villagers gathered in pairs along the high street, their voices low but urgent. Nothing so dreadful had happened in living memory not to quiet, fussy Miss Farrow, who lived alone above the post office and had never been known to quarrel with anyone except, perhaps, the delivery man when he forgot her morning paper. Mrs. Hartnell, who prided herself on knowing everything before everyone else, declared in the grocer's queue that it must have been burglars. These dreadful vagrants from the main road, the sort who pretend to sell holly and then break into houses, mark my words, it's them. But Mr. Weatherby from the butchery shook his head gravely. "Burglars don't leave the till untouched," he said. No, this is personal." In her rose-covered cottage on Old Mill Lane, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting needles motionless upon her lap. She had spent the morning attending to her canary and thinking quietly over what she had seen at the post office. The footprint, so small and deliberate, kept returning to her mind. It was the kind of detail others overlooked, a thing too ordinary to seem important, yet unmistakably out of place. At 11 o'clock, a soft knock came at her door. When she opened it, she found the vicar standing there, his face pale and troubled. "My dear Miss Marple," he began, "I hardly know where to turn. I've just come from the police station. They've asked me about that letter I received last night." She gestured for him to come in, setting aside the kettle as he sat by the hearth. "It upset you, I imagine," she said, gently. He nodded, removing his spectacles. "It did. I can't make head nor tail of it. The handwriting's unfamiliar. And then this morning, hearing of Miss Farrow's death, it seems almost. The police think I'm letting my imagination run away with me. But I can't help wondering." Miss Marple folded her hands calmly. "I wonder too. It's remarkable how coincidences so rarely turn out to be what they seem." He hesitated, glancing about the cozy sitting room before lowering his voice. "There's something else, Miss Marple. I didn't tell Inspector Craddock, at least. Not yet. The letter mentioned the old rectory and the night of the 19th. But nothing happened there, or so I thought. That property's been empty for years. Empty houses," Miss Marple mused, "have a way of not being quite so empty as people assume. I remember a case in Little Paddock where a supposed vacant cottage turned out to be the nightly retreat of a most unsuitable couple. Appearances deceive, Mr. Clement, particularly in a small place where everyone feels observed." The vicar looked uneasy. "Do you suppose I should show the letter to the inspector?" "Oh, yes," she said softly. But perhaps after luncheon, he'll be less inclined to dismiss it once he's had a meal and a moment to think. Men so often reason better on a full stomach. He smiled faintly, despite his worry. You always seem to know the right thing to say. Experience, she replied, and a lifetime of listening to what others overlook. When he had gone, Miss Marple stood at the window, watching the villagers drift along the lane. Each face told a story. Mrs. Price Ridley, marching purposefully toward the church. Dr. Haydock's motor car speeding past, and young Tommy Leggett still lingering near the post office, where a constable now kept watch. She noticed the boy bend slightly, picking something up from the snow before hurrying away in the direction of the vicarage. By mid-afternoon, Inspector Craddock called again at the vicarage, where Miss Marple happened to be taking tea with Mrs. Clement. The inspector looked weary, but intrigued. We've spoken with half the village, he said. No one heard a thing last night, and yet someone left by that back door. We found faint traces of ash on the doorstep, pipe tobacco, possibly, but Miss Farrow didn't smoke. Miss Marple's eyes brightened slightly. Pipe tobacco, she repeated, stirring her tea. How very interesting. You know, Inspector, people often mistake tobacco ash for something trivial, but one learns a good deal from ashes, especially if one has watched a lifetime of men pretending to give up smoking for Lent. Craddock gave her a quick, puzzled glance, but before he could question her further, the vicar entered the room with the folded letter. I thought you should have this, he said gravely. As the inspector read, his brow darkened. The old rectory, eh? And a lie, no less. Well, that gives us something new to chew on. Miss Marple sipped her tea serenely. It may indeed, Inspector. Lies are most revealing things. People tell them not only to conceal what they've done, but sometimes to hide what they've felt. Outside, the church bell tolled softly over the snow, and somewhere far down the lane, a shutter slammed in the wind. In that quiet moment, Miss Marple's knitting lay forgotten beside her as she stared thoughtfully into the fire. Something in the vicar's letter, in the timing of its arrival, and in the faint trace of pipe ash outside the post office. All of it whispered of a secret the village had tried to bury. But as Miss Marple knew too well, secrets never stayed buried long in Mary Mead. Inspector Craddock left the vicarage. Miss Marple, after polite thanks to Griselda, set out with her knitting bag. She did not go directly home. The lane behind the post office drew her narrow, trampled, edged by a low wall that collected the day's secrets. The snow had melted in small scallops, not from sun, but from warmth within, and a patch lay near the back step darker than the rest, as if ash had wet it. She noted, too, a faint inward turn in a single print, as if a foot had paused to listen. At the vicarage gate she met young Tommy Leggett, who tried to hide a twist of grocer's paper. A gentle question produced his prize. 3 black grains he had shaken from the lane because they smelt like Grandad's chair. Miss Marple tucked them into her reticule, told him true science began with warm ears and dry feet, and sent him off promising to report any further discoveries to the vicar. On the high street, Dr. Haydock fastened his motorcar bonnet. He said the bruise on Miss Farrow's temple bore an odd crescent, as if cloth had covered a sharper edge. A fall could do it, but the mark troubled him. The living are always too eager to improve on the dead, he said. Restraint, Jane. She replied that observation was restraint with better manners, and walked on thinking of crescents, cloth, and heavy objects that leave prints through wool. Craddock, taking statements, allowed her a brief return to the little office. A grey cardigan with a pulled thread hung on a peg. The parcel shelf showed a faint, greasy gleam, as if oilskin had rested there. The heavy wooden parcel stamp sat slightly askew. Under its handle clung a smear of wax. The locked drawer remained stubborn. The key, usually on Miss Farrow's ring, had not been found. Tidy women do not mislay keys on Christmas night unless someone helps them. Outside, Mrs. Hartnell appeared in a gust of certainty and announced that Mr. Leonard Pike, the organist, had been seen near the old rectory after choir practice, with his collar up like a conspirator. He smoked a pipe, she added, which always means weakness of principle. Miss Marple thanked her and considered Pike, conscientious, shabby, kind. Good men sometimes keep foolish secrets. Craddock returned with news. An unsigned telegram had arrived for Miss Farrow on the 20th, requesting that a parcel be kept for one Mr. William Snipe, collection on the 21st. No one had come. The parcel had been placed in the locked drawer. Snipe means nothing to anyone, he said. Miss Marple observed that bird names suit people who wish to be unnoticed. They walked as evening glazed the snow. From the church drifted a tentative phrase, Pike at the organ finding the hymn. Draper's sold heel inserts last week, Craddock said. Left higher than right, size 8, cash. He looked sideways. You noticed the inward turn. Limp? Perhaps not, she said. Comfort often betrays itself. At the bend to the rectory path, Miss Marple stopped. From the long disused chimneys rose a thin thread of smoke. The front door was latched, the back yielded grudgingly. In the drawing room, a timid glow and a drift of grey that had been letters minutes before. Only now. In the ash lay a comma of red wax, still soft. Craddock prodded gently and revealed a charred corner, impressed with part of a seal, 2 letters only, perhaps an S entwined with another. Someone tidying, he muttered. Someone who believes paper sins less once it is ash, Miss Marple said. It rarely does. On the mantel stood an empty brandy bottle and 2 glasses, one bearing a modest rose lipstick print. The rectory had stood empty. Guests had come here to be unobserved. Miss Marple thought of the crescent bruise, the missing key, a pipe saved for holidays, and a name that flew under hedges. Craddock pocketed the wax and a curl of ash. We'll speak to Pike, he said, and to anyone who used this house for privacy. Yes, Miss Marple answered, watching the smoke thin into the blue. Privacy serves very well until it is called to witness. The air inside the old rectory was heavy with the smell of burnt paper and damp plaster, and the faint, almost sorrowful echo of the fire crackling in the hearth. Inspector Craddock crouched near the ashes, his gloved hands sifting through the remains with quiet precision. Miss Marple stood behind him, her sharp eyes moving slowly across the room, noticing the tiniest irregularities, the dust undisturbed on one side of the mantel, the faint smudge of a heel near the window, and a chair that had been dragged slightly askew from the rug. Nothing spoke loudly, but everything whispered. 2 glasses, Craddock murmured, lifting them carefully. You saw the lipstick. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, indeed. A very particular shade. I fancy only one woman in the village would be bold enough to wear such a colour, Mrs. Leslie Bartlett, the chemist's wife. She's rather fond of making an impression, though perhaps not the kind she intends. Craddock frowned. You think she met someone here? Oh, I shouldn't say think, Miss Marple replied gently. Not yet, but one learns a good deal from tone and temper. Mrs. Bartlett prides herself on discretion. Such women are always the first to be found without it. They left the rectory as dusk thickened into early evening. The road glowed faintly under the lamplight, and snow began to fall again, soft and unhurried. Miss Marple walked with small, deliberate steps, her mind weaving the threads together. Miss Farrow had locked something away, a parcel for a man called Snipe, and now both the letter and the key were gone. Someone had met another in secrecy at the old rectory, and there had been brandy, laughter perhaps, followed by a quarrel. At the corner, they crossed paths with Dr. Haydock, who pulled up sharply in his car. I was on my way to you, Craddock, he called. The post-mortem result came through sooner than expected. Miss Farrow's death was not a fall. The bruise, yes, but there's also evidence of strangulation, light but sufficient. A scarf, or glove, perhaps. She died before she hit the floor. Craddock exhaled heavily. That settles it then. Murder. Dr. Haydock's tone softened as he turned to Miss Marple. "You always said as much, didn't you?" She inclined her head. It seemed most improbable that Miss Farrow would slip at all. She was precise in everything she did, even in dying. I dare say she would have done it tidily. Craddock gave a short, grim laugh. Well, whoever did this knew her routine. She closed up around 11 after service, never later. No sign of forced entry, so she must have opened the door willingly. Someone she trusted, or thought she did. And someone, Miss Marple said softly, who knew the parcel existed. They returned to the village under the falling snow. Lights glowed warmly through cottage windows, the illusion of peace sitting prettily upon the streets. But Miss Marple knew better. Peace in a village was often a painted thing, thin as frost and twice as fragile. That evening, she called upon Mrs. Bartlett under the pretext of purchasing cough lozenges. The chemist's wife, tall and fair, with an anxious smile, seemed flustered at the unexpected visit. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured tea. "How dreadful about poor Miss Farrow," Mrs. Bartlett said, her voice too bright. "I saw her just last week. She was quite herself, though she did mention something about a parcel mix-up. I told her she worried far too much." Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. "Oh, I'm sure you were quite right, my dear. Such little muddles happen to us all. Still, it's curious, isn't it, how things left unsaid have a way of finding their moment." Mrs. Bartlett hesitated, color rising faintly in her cheeks. "I really wouldn't know." Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the hearth, where a faint trace of red lipstick glowed against the rim of a teacup on the mantel. The same shade, unmistakably. "You wear a most striking color," she said, lightly. "It suits you. Almost the exact hue I saw this morning, though, of course, it may only be my poor eyes playing tricks." Mrs. Bartlett laughed, too quickly. "You must have keen eyes, Miss Marple. I only wear it for special occasions." "How lovely," Miss Marple murmured, taking her leave soon after. But as she stepped back into the snow-laced street, her expression turned thoughtful. The lipstick, the secrecy, the letter all pointed toward a chain of confidences that had gone terribly awry. Someone had been deceived, and Miss Farrow, tidy and meticulous, had stumbled upon that deception too soon. At her cottage window later that night, she watched the lights of the vicarage dim one by one. The village had folded itself into sleep, yet beneath its calm exterior, fear had begun to take root. Somewhere among the snow-covered roofs, a killer walked free, perhaps watching, perhaps waiting. Miss Marple, her knitting untouched beside her, simply murmured to the silence, "Yes, but secrets never stay warm for long. Sooner or later, the frost finds them." The following morning brought a brittle sunlight that cut across the rooftops, sharp and cold as glass. Frost glazed the hedgerows, and smoke rose from chimneys like quiet sighs. Yet beneath that picturesque calm, tension coiled through Mary Mead. People spoke in lowered voices. The clatter of the milk cart seemed louder than usual, and each footstep on the cobbles carried a kind of wary deliberation, as though the village itself had become a stage where everyone feared being seen in the wrong act. Miss Marple, seated near her sitting-room window, finished reading the morning's newspaper without taking in a word of it. Her thoughts returned again and again to the parcel, the mysterious object meant for one Mr. William Snipe, and to Miss Farrow's final hours. She had spoken of that parcel to several villagers. Anyone might have known, but Miss Marple's instincts told her that only someone, deeply involved with it, would risk entering the post office after midnight. It was not mere curiosity, it was desperation. Her musings were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Inspector Craddock, snow dusting his coat collar, his manner brisk but drawn. "Morning, Miss Marple. I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all," she said kindly. "You look as though you've been up since dawn. Coffee?" He accepted with a grateful nod, and while she poured, he unfolded a small envelope. "This turned up this morning in the ashes from the rectory fireplace. The men missed it last night. We managed to piece most of it together. It's part of a letter, apparently written by Miss Farrow herself." Miss Marple took the fragile, browned scrap carefully between her fingers. Only a few words were legible. "Cannot continue to keep this any longer. If he finds out, it will ruin everything." Craddock leaned forward. "Now, who's he? That's the question. Could she have been referring to Mr. Bartlett? You hinted last night that his wife might have been involved in something unsavory." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I only said her lipstick was unsuitably adventurous for Christmas Eve, Inspector. But yes, there may be more between the Bartletts than meets the eye. I should not be surprised if Miss Farrow had become entangled in one of their little domestic dramas." Craddock frowned. "The husband's temper is well known. A jealous man by all accounts. But if he's involved, why burn letters at the rectory? It's miles from their home." "Because," Miss Marple said softly, "it was where they could be unseen. And perhaps not he, but she. You see, women often seek privacy not for deceit, but for fear. If Mrs. Bartlett feared discovery not of an affair, but of a secret she'd been made to keep, then she might have chosen a place where gossip could not follow." Before Craddock could respond, a hurried knock came at the door. It was young Tommy Leggett again, breathless from running. "Please, Miss Marple, Sir Mum says I should fetch you both quick. They found something by the churchyard gate, wrapped up in paper, like it was dropped." Within 10 minutes, they stood at the edge of the gate, where a constable held a crumpled parcel, half buried in slush. The brown paper was torn, the string frayed, but beneath it was something unexpected. A small, ornate metal box, tarnished but elegant, with initials engraved faintly upon the lid. L.B. Craddock raised an eyebrow. "Leslie Bartlett again. And what do you make of this?" Miss Marple's gloved hands brushed away the frost. "A jewelry casket," she said softly. "18th century. Not valuable enough to kill for, perhaps, but sentimental value often weighs heavier than gold." Inside lay a faded ribbon, a broken cameo brooch, and a folded note. The writing was unmistakable. Miss Farrow's tidy, deliberate script. "For safekeeping, as promised. No one must ever know." Craddock stared at the words. "This was the parcel," he said grimly. "The one for Mr. Snipe." "But why the alias?" Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, her tone calm but pointed. "Because, Inspector, the name Snipe is merely a disguise, a code between two people who shared something they shouldn't. Miss Farrow must have been keeping this for someone who could not risk being known, and the initials on the box tell us who." Craddock looked startled. "You mean Mrs. Bartlett?" Miss Marple gave the faintest smile. "Or perhaps not Mrs. Bartlett at all. You see, initials can be very misleading. I believe this box once belonged to her husband and that she was trying to hide it from him." The inspector's expression darkened. "Then that makes her not a lover, but an accomplice, or a frightened witness." Miss Marple's knitting lay forgotten on her lap, her eyes thoughtful and bright as candle flame. "Yes, Inspector," she said quietly. "And if she was frightened enough to hide this, then whoever killed Miss Farrow is not finished yet." Inspector Craddock stared at the jewelry casket, as though it might confess if glared at long enough. The faint initials L.B. gleamed through the tarnish like a whisper refusing to fade. Miss Marple watched him quietly, her hands folded neatly over her handbag. The villagers had gathered in a respectful semicircle near the gate, pretending to look elsewhere, though their eyes betrayed their hunger for scandal. Mrs. Hartnell was already whispering to the baker's wife that the Bartletts were not what they seemed, while old Mr. Symes muttered that nothing good ever came of fancy initials on things. Craddock ordered the crowd away with firm efficiency. "All right, folks. Go about your business. This isn't a pantomime." When they'd dispersed, he turned to Miss Marple. "We'll need to question the Bartletts separately, and quickly." "Yes," she agreed softly, before they have time to rehearse their lines. At the chemist's shop, Mr. Leonard Bartlett greeted them with an air of injured dignity. A solid man with thinning hair and a clipped moustache, he prided himself on being the village's picture of respectability. Yet his hands trembled slightly as he replaced a bottle of cough syrup behind the counter. "Terrible business, Inspector," he said at once. "Poor Miss Farrow, she was always so careful. I can't imagine anyone wanting to harm her." Craddock studied him. "You knew her well, didn't you? You delivered medicines to her house regularly." Bartlett nodded. "Purely professional, I assure you. She suffered from neuralgia." His tone held faint irritation, as though honesty were a matter of accounting rather than conscience. Miss Marple's gaze drifted over the counter. A pipe, half-filled, rested beside a tin of tobacco. She recognized the scent, instantly rich. Spiced. The same blend that had lingered in the post office. She said nothing, only adjusted her glove and looked mildly sympathetic. "How very good of you to still attend to your patients on Christmas Eve," she said pleasantly. "You must have been quite late that night." "Not especially," Bartlett replied too quickly. "Home by 10:30. "How punctual," she murmured. "I've always admired punctual men, though sometimes, of course, clocks disagree. The church clock, for instance, is nearly 10 minutes slow." Bartlett's eyes flickered toward her before he composed himself. "Then I suppose it may have been nearer 11. Craddock stepped in, holding up the recovered casket. "Do you recognize this, Mr. Bartlett?" The chemist froze, his mouth opening slightly before he caught himself. "I can't say I do. Should I? It bears your initials." He peered at it, forcing a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "Coincidence, surely. Leslie has a trinket or two with those letters. I expect it's hers." Craddock's gaze was steady. "And yet, it was found near the churchyard, wrapped up like something to be hidden. Care to explain how your wife's property ended there?" "I've no idea," Bartlett said tightly. "Perhaps she dropped it. She's absent-minded." "Or frightened," Miss Marple murmured, almost as though to herself. Bartlett's head turned sharply, but she smiled serenely, offering no further explanation. When they reached the Bartletts' home, Mrs. Bartlett was pale, her lipstick gone, her composure fraying at the edges. She met them in the parlor, hands twisting the edge of a handkerchief. "I suppose you found it," she said quietly, before either of them spoke. Craddock's voice softened. "You know about the casket, then?" She nodded, lowering her eyes. "It was mine once. My husband gave it to me before we married, but I gave it to Miss Farrow 3 months ago to keep safe." "To keep safe from whom?" "Miss," Marple asked gently. Mrs. Bartlett hesitated, then whispered, "From Leonard. He didn't know I'd pawned a brooch, a family piece, to pay off a debt he owed. I was terrified he'd find out. Miss Farrow offered to hold the casket until after Christmas, when I could retrieve it quietly." Craddock leaned forward. "And this Mr. Snipe? The alias?" Her eyes widened. I don't know anything about that. She never mentioned such a name." Miss Marple watched her face carefully. "You're quite certain, my dear? Because it would be a very strange coincidence if someone else, perhaps someone who knew of the arrangement, used that name to collect the parcel before you could." "Mrs." Bartlett's voice trembled. "I swear I don't know. I never meant for any of this." From the hallway came the creak of a floorboard. Bartlett stood there, eyes dark with fury. "You've said quite enough, Leslie." Craddock straightened. "You'll both come with me, sir. I think it's time we had a proper talk at the station." As they left, Miss Marple lingered at the doorway, her expression unreadable. She noticed, half hidden behind the umbrella stand, a woman's glove crushed, damp, and dusted faintly with ash. She picked it up delicately. "Ash," she murmured. "Not from a hearth, from burnt paper." When Craddock returned to escort her home, she handed him the glove without comment. "Keep it safe, Inspector. It seems our little village has been playing with fire in more ways than one." The Bartletts were taken to the station just as dusk settled again over Mary Mead, and the church bell gave its melancholy chime across the snow. Word of their questioning spread through the village before the inspector's car had even reached the green. By the time Miss Marple returned home, there were already small clusters of neighbors murmuring in doorways, their voices low and tremulous with speculation. She gave them her gentle nod as she passed, looking for all the world like a harmless old lady thinking only of her evening tea. Yet her mind was quietly turning, threading together all that had unfolded since midnight mass. Inside her cottage, the fire burned low, the shadows deep. She sat before it, fingers clasped lightly in her lap, thinking not of guilt or innocence, but of human weakness, the way fear could drive people into folly, and folly into silence. Miss Farrow's death had not been planned like a crime of passion. It had been tidied afterward, covered as one might sweep dust beneath a rug. But dust, like truth, has a way of creeping back into the light. The glove she had found at the Bartlett's house lay on the table beside her. Its faint smell of burnt paper stirred her thoughts again toward the rectory fire, where letters had been destroyed, and where the name Snipe had been used to conceal a transaction. The pattern was growing clearer, yet there was something still missing, something small, almost domestic, that refused to fall into place. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft tapping at the window. It was young Tommy Leggett once more, hat askew, cheeks flushed from the cold. "Sorry, Miss Marple," he whispered when she opened the door. "Mum says you ought to know the vicar's wife found a piece o' letter in the churchyard hedge. She thought it might be nothing, but it's got your name written on it." He handed her a crumpled scrap, half torn and faintly damp. The ink had run in places, but enough words remained to chill her. "You warned me, but it's too late now. He came last night. Please, tell Miss Marple." Her heart gave a quiet, steady beat of understanding. She thanked the boy and sent him home, then wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and walked briskly into the cold. The moon was rising, thin and sharp, and the snow glowed faintly beneath it. The vicarage window still shone with lamplight, and she found Mr. Clement and his wife seated by the hearth, the fragment spread on the table between them. "I thought you should see it," said the vicar gravely. "It was caught on the hedge near the rectory gate. The rest must have blown away." Miss Marple read it once more in silence. "Then someone," she said slowly, "intended this to reach me. Poor Miss Farrow. Perhaps, though not by her own hand, she would never leave anything half done. No, this was placed deliberately, as though the writer wanted me to find only part of the truth." Griselda frowned. "But who would?" "The person who fears too much light, my dear," Miss Marple replied gently. "The same one who burned the letters and forgot the ash that clung to a glove. The same one who knew Miss Farrow had something that could not be destroyed because it was not on paper at all." Craddock arrived soon after, his manner brisk but wary. "We've had a turn," he told them grimly. "Bartlett's alibi fell apart. He wasn't home when he said he was, but his wife's confession doesn't line up either. She insists she never saw Miss Farrow after the morning before the service." Miss Marple looked up sharply. "Then who delivered the letter to the vicarage after Mass?" "Someone took great care to see it arrive just past midnight." Craddock blinked. "You think it wasn't Miss Farrow herself?" "Certainly not," she said quietly. "Miss Farrow was already dead before that letter was ever posted. I believe she wrote it earlier that evening, perhaps even before she went to church, but someone else saw fit to deliver it later, to give the illusion she was still alive." The inspector's eyes widened. "Then the killer must have known her handwriting, her habits, even her way of folding a note." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze distant. "Yes, and I think that person was not one of the Bartletts." "Then who?" She rose, her shawl falling lightly over her shoulders. "There is one man in Mary Mead who smokes that particular tobacco, who had reason to be near the post office that night, and who would have been trusted if he knocked on her door after midnight." The vicar's face drained of color. "You don't mean our church organist?" Miss Marple's eyes, calm and keen as frost, met his. "I'm afraid I do, Mr. Leonard Pike. And if I'm not mistaken, Inspector, you'll find that his pipe, his shoes, and his conscience will tell the rest of the story." Inspector Craddock stared at Miss Marple for a moment, as though her calm words had briefly robbed him of speech. "Leonard Pike," he repeated slowly. "The organist? Good heavens, what possible reason would he have to harm Miss Farrow? He's one of the most unassuming men in the parish. Miss Marple's expression softened, though her tone remained steady. Yes, unassuming is precisely the word. Inspector. The sort of man who moves quietly through life, unnoticed, yet often sees more than anyone suspects. It is remarkable, isn't it, how those who observe in silence sometimes come to know the most inconvenient truths. Craddock frowned, pacing near the vicarage hearth. We'll pay him a visit tonight. Then, he's likely at the rectory still. He's been helping the verger clear snow off the path for tomorrow's service. Miss Marple rose with unhurried grace, her knitting bag tucked neatly under her arm. If you'll allow me to accompany you, Inspector, I believe I might be of use. There are some things that men hesitate to reveal to other men, but will confess to an old lady with a kind word and a bit of patience. Craddock hesitated, then nodded. Very well, but please, Miss Marple, stay behind me if there's any trouble. They crossed the narrow lane, snow crunching beneath their boots, breath turning to mist in the frozen air. The church loomed ahead, its windows glowing faintly from the light within. A faint, melancholy chord drifted from the organ. Mr. Pike, indeed, still at his post. He looked up as they entered, his mild face startled but not fearful. "Inspector Craddock, Miss Marple, is there news?" Craddock's voice was calm, but his eyes were sharp. "There might be, Mr. Pike. We'd like a word about Christmas Eve and your movements after the service." Pike's hands lingered on the keys, a faint tremor in his fingers. "After the service? Why, I locked up the church as usual, then went home. Straight home." Miss Marple approached the pews, her footsteps gentle on the flagstone floor. "You didn't stop by the post office then? I do recall seeing your light still burning later than usual that night." He blinked, confusion flickering across his face before settling into practiced calm. "No, I assure you, I wasn't anywhere near the post office." The inspector removed a small paper packet from his pocket, opening it on the pew between them. Inside were a few dark flakes tobacco ash. "We found this near Miss Farrow's back door. Same blend you use, Mr. Pike. Rather a rare one, according to the tobacconist in Much Benham." For the first time, Pike's composure faltered. His shoulders sagged. "Yes, I suppose it is mine," he admitted softly. "But I didn't kill her, Inspector. I swear it. I only went to see her to talk." "Talk about what?" Craddock's tone remained steady, though Miss Marple could sense his pulse quicken. Pike's voice grew strained. "About the letter. She came to me a few days before Christmas. Said she'd been keeping something for Mrs. Bartlett, something that might ruin her husband if it got out. She didn't want the responsibility anymore. I told her to post it to the vicar, that he was the only man who could keep it safe. But she refused. Said she meant to deliver it herself after Mass." Miss Marple's eyes glimmered. "So you followed her that night?" He turned toward her, his face pale in the candlelight. "Yes. I thought she might need help carrying it. She was a nervous woman, you know that. When I reached the post office, I saw her through the window, arguing with someone. A man. He was standing in the shadows, near the counter. I couldn't see his face, but I knew from his stance, his way of holding his hat, it was Bartlett. I'm certain of it." Craddock leaned forward. "You're telling us you saw Bartlett inside?" "Yes. I was about to go in when I heard her cry out. I panicked. I didn't know what to do. By the time I reached the door, it was locked. I pounded on it, but no one answered. When I finally got it open through the back, she was lying there, and Bartlett was gone." Miss Marple's gaze was fixed on him, her expression unreadable. "Then why didn't you tell the police what you saw?" He hesitated, swallowing hard. "Because of the letter. I thought it would come back on me. She'd asked me to post it if anything happened to her. And so, I did. I slipped it under the vicar's door after midnight, just as she'd written it. But I swear I never harmed her." Silence hung between them. The church seemed to hold its breath. Craddock's face was stern, but not unsympathetic. "You realize this puts you in a difficult position, Mr. Pike." Withholding evidence, destroying a letter, these are serious matters. I didn't destroy it, Pike said quickly. I copied it out. She had written 2 versions, the one to the vicar and one for herself. I burned the rest because she begged me to keep her confidence, and I cared for her, Inspector. Not romantically, but kindly. She was lonely. Miss Marple's voice, when it came, was soft and sorrowful. You poor, foolish man. You meant to help her, and instead, you've made yourself her final companion. He bowed his head. You'll arrest me now, I suppose. Craddock shook his head slowly. Not yet. You've given us a new trail to follow, and I'll need to confirm your story before we do. Anything rash, but don't leave the village. As they stepped out into the cold night once more, the wind stirred the snow into brief, ghostly swirls. Craddock lit a cigarette, his face thoughtful. Do you believe him? Miss Marple's lips curved faintly. In part. He tells the truth about seeing Bartlett, but not about what else he saw or what he took from the scene. He said he copied a letter. Inspector. But he burned one version too many. I suspect Miss Farrow's original note still exists, hidden, perhaps, in a place where a man of conscience thought no one would look. Craddock glanced at her. And where would that be? She turned her eyes toward the darkened church tower, where the faint sound of the organ still lingered like an echo. In a place sanctified by habit. Inspector. Somewhere sacred to him where guilt and duty would be indistinguishable. I believe our dear Mr. Pike has hidden his secret within the church itself. The inspector exhaled slowly, watching his breath vanish in the cold. Then we'd best find it before someone else does. Miss Marple nodded, her gaze unwavering. Yes, for once guilt begins to stir in a quiet heart, it seldom sleeps long. And I fear, Inspector, that before the dawn breaks over Mary Mead, it will drive someone else to act again. The nave was empty when they returned, the church's hush broken only by the faint settling of ancient timbers and a thread of cold drifting from the tower stairs. Miss Marple paused by the organ, her hand resting lightly on the polished rail as if greeting an old friend. Habits, she murmured, almost to herself. When people are frightened, they don't invent new places. They return to the ones they know. Inspector Craddock lifted the lid of the hymn book cupboard. Rows of hymns, ancient and modern, stood like obedient soldiers. He began checking spines, then slid a volume free. Nothing. Another. And another. Patience, Miss Marple always said, is simply curiosity with good manners. She did not start with the books at all. Instead, she knelt by the organ bench, peering beneath its lip. A scrap of cotton thread clung where a panel didn't quite meet the frame. With a delicate tug, the panel yielded, revealing a shallow cavity no larger than a psalter. Inside lay a folded paper packet and something that glinted faintly like a tiny river stone. She passed both up, and Craddock's eyebrows climbed. The paper was tied with blue silk. The glint was a brass key on a thin ribbon, the sort a tidy woman might carry close and never misplace of her own accord. Craddock opened the packet carefully, a familiar, tidy hand. The first line made him exhale. From Emily Farrow to the vicar, he read. If anything happens to me, if fear should make me weak, you must know that the parcel was not mine to keep. I held it for L.B., who begged me to hide it from her husband. He is not a cruel man, but pride in men can be more dangerous than cruelty. On the night of the 19th at the old rectory, I heard voices, Mr. Bartlett's among them, and a promise about debts to be buried with Christmas. I have locked the casket until the right person asks in the right name. If the wrong one comes first, he will call himself Mr. Snipe. The last lines blurred, where a drop had fallen. I cannot continue to keep this any longer. Please, Vicar, be kind to her. The truth belongs in God's house. The key, Craddock said quietly, weighing the brass. So Pike hid exactly what you guessed. He looked toward the chancel. And this locks the drawer in the post office that we couldn't open. Miss Marple considered the letter's phrasing. Notice how she writes her husband without naming her. Emily was careful, but she assumed the vicar would understand those initials. Everyone knows Leslie Bartlett as L.B. And equally, everyone knows a man like Leonard would mistake the box as his. Her eyes were grave. What matters is the condition attached. The right person must ask in the right name. Mr. Snipe is a test, inspector, a decoy that only an eavesdropper would know. They left the church with the key wrapped in the blue silk, the letter copied into Craddock's notebook, and the original tucked safe against his heart. Snow sifted down again, a fine glitter in the lamplight. Halfway along the lane they smelled smoke, thin at first, then thicker, with the oily tang of damp wood. Craddock broke into a run. The old rectory's chimney breathed a sooty plume, and orange trembled behind a blind. Inside, a brand on the hearth flamed across a litter of scraps. Someone had scarcely begun. The pile was clumsy, desperate. Craddock kicked the burning heap wide and stamped. Miss Marple snatched the kettle from the hob and doused the rest. From the back passage came the hurried clatter of a latch, then silence. Craddock was at the door in 3 strides. He threw it open to nothing but night and the owl's blunt cry. On the half-charred paper near the grate, a ledger column refused to blacken. Miss Marple teased it free with the tongs. Names, quantities, dates Bartlett's fine accountant's hand. Laudanum returned, cash advanced, private notations in a neat cipher. At the margin of December 19th, a single initial, L. Opposite a figure large enough to hurt a proud man more than a bad man. She laid it flat on the table to cool. "Debts to be buried with Christmas," she said gently, recalling Emily's phrase. "Not crimes, debts. Men will do very foolish things rather than be seen as foolish." The door banged, and Leonard Bartlett stood there, ruddy with cold, breath smoking, eyes inflamed by more than wind. "What are you doing in my house?" he snapped, then saw where he was and corrected himself with a jerk. "This isn't my. What is this place to you?" "To you, Mr. Bartlett," Craddock said evenly. "Bonfire." He held up the ledger page. "Recognize your hand." Bartlett's gaze flicked and hardened. "You have no warrant." "I have a murder," Craddock replied. For an instant the chemist's jaw worked, but pride drew itself like lacquer across his face. "A ledger means nothing. Every shopkeeper keeps one." "Every shopkeeper," Miss Marple said mildly, "does not lend laudanum on tick and hide the entries behind initials. Nor does every shopkeeper arrange signals like Mr. Snipe to test who knows what they shouldn't." He rounded on her. "You sanctimonious. What do you know of any of it? Only that a tidy woman was killed because she would not surrender a key," Miss Marple said softly, "and because a frightened wife asked her to keep a box until after Christmas. Emily's letter speaks of kindness, not vengeance. You mistake the scale of the thing, Mr. Bartlett. Your wife feared your shame more than your temper." His shoulders dropped as if a cord had been cut. "I never touched Emily," he said hoarsely. "She was alive when I left. We argued. Yes, I begged for the box, only the box. It was mine once. My mother's cameo was inside. She refused. Said she would fetch it in the morning, with the vicar present. I struck the counter with that blasted stamp and made a fool of myself. Then I went home." Craddock's eyes narrowed. "And the strangling?" "I didn't," Bartlett said, voice low. "I swear to God I didn't." Miss Marple's look was very gentle. "No," she said. "You lose your dignity loudly, Mr. Bartlett, not quietly. The mark on her temple would be your temper, but the scarf would be someone else's tidying. Someone who came after you, meaning to snatch the key and finding she had fallen, and then making certainty of silence." "She?" Craddock repeated. Outside, feet stumbled on gravel. The door shuddered and Leslie Bartlett stood blinking at the smoke, hair unpinned, face white. "Leonard?" she whispered, then saw the paper on the table. The key's blue ribbon, the old shame, and the new. "I came to stop him," she said quietly to Miss Marple, not looking at her husband at all. "But I'm too late, aren't I?" Not too late for the truth, Miss Marple answered. Only for secrecy. Leslie's hands, ungloved, showed a reddened mark along the wrist where wool had chafed. She saw Miss Marple see it and closed her eyes. I went after him that night, after service, she said. He had promised me, oh, foolish, foolish, promised he'd ask Emily and be done. When I reached the post office, the back door was unlatched. She was on the floor. I thought he had killed her. I thought if the key stayed, it would hang us all. So I took it. I only tightened the scarf because I thought she might cry out. Craddock did not move. The fire's last hiss seemed very loud. Leonard's face had gone to chalk. Leslie, he said, awe and something like pity in his voice. You little fool. Miss Marple laid the blue ribbon on the table between them. Guilt, she said, is a poor housekeeper. It breaks more than it mends. The kindest thing now is not concealment, but order. We shall tell it as it happened, without embroidery. Leslie lifted her head. And the name Mr. Snipe? A listener's flourish, Miss Marple replied. A magpie word, stolen from talk in the lane. Not yours at all. She glanced toward the church, where the dark tower cut the snow-lit sky. And not your husband's. We still have one small bird to catch. The silence in the old rectory seemed to thicken after Miss Marple's last words, as if the walls themselves were listening. Inspector Craddock stood motionless, the blue ribbon still glinting faintly in his hand. Leonard Bartlett stared at his wife with hollow disbelief. The anger drained from him, leaving only bewildered fatigue. Leslie's eyes glistened, but did not plead. She looked almost relieved, as though the weight she had carried since Christmas Eve had finally loosened its grip. Miss Marple, standing a little apart, watched them both with a calm that concealed a deep current of pity. There's always another layer, she said softly, her tone more like reflection than accusation. When people hide one secret, it so often draws another to it like ivy round an old wall. It grows, even when no one tends it. Craddock turned to her. You mentioned another bird to catch, Miss Marple. Who did you mean? Her eyes, bright and unreadable, met his. The one who called himself Mr. Snipe, she replied quietly. The one who knew of the arrangement between Miss Farrow and Mrs. Bartlett before either woman could have spoken of it. That wasn't knowledge, it was overheard gossip, bent to convenience. And who listens most in a village? Inspector, while pretending to see nothing. He frowned, thinking. Pike. Miss Marple gave a small, grave nod. Yes, he was in the churchyard that evening, he admitted as much. He followed Emily. Not merely out of concern, but because he'd already guessed what she was hiding. When he saw Bartlett arguing with her, he didn't intervene. He waited until Bartlett left, then went inside. Leslie's breath caught, a faint, choked sound. You mean he finished what was already begun, Miss Marple said gently, but not from cruelty, from fear. He was terrified she'd expose what she'd seen that night at the rectory. You see, Emily Farrow wasn't just a postmistress with a taste for order, she was also a witness. Craddock stepped closer, his voice low. Witness to what? Exactly. To a meeting that wasn't supposed to happen. Miss Marple replied. Bartlett came to the rectory that evening to settle his debt. Yes, but he wasn't alone. Pike was there first. He'd been borrowing small amounts from Bartlett for years, through the pretext of church repairs and organ maintenance. Emily went to return a letter Mrs. Bartlett had asked her to keep safe, and she overheard their quarrel, one man desperate for money, the other threatening exposure. When Bartlett stormed out, she thought the danger over. But Pike panicked. He realized that if she spoke, both he and Bartlett would be ruined. So he went to her house later, asking for forgiveness, and she, kind as always, let him in. He killed her, then tried to make it look like an accident. Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes, he used her own scarf, meaning only to silence her for a moment. But fear makes clumsy hands. Inspector. When he saw what he'd done, he locked the door, took the key, and left through the back. He must have returned later to retrieve what she'd hidden, but Mrs. Bartlett had already been there first. Leonard Bartlett's face had turned ashen. "And all this time," he murmured, "he stood beside me in church, playing hymns, while my wife and I—" He broke off, his voice cracking. Miss Marple's gaze softened. "Guilt and grief often sit side by side in a pew, Mr. Bartlett. One plays while the other prays. It's an old partnership." Craddock straightened, resolve settling on him like his overcoat. "We'll find him now. If he's guilty, he won't get far." But Miss Marple's expression turned almost sorrowful. "I rather think he won't try, Inspector. Men like Mr. Pike are not made for running. They believe they can atone with silence, and when that fails, they look to the nearest sanctuary. I expect we'll find him where he's always belonged, among the hymns." They left the rectory and crossed the lane toward the church once more. The great doors were unlatched, swaying slightly in the wind. Inside, the candles still burned upon the altar, flickering in the draught. And there, slumped against the base of the organ, sat Leonard Pike, his face grey, his eyes hollow but strangely calm. He did not move as they approached. His hands rested on the keys, pressing one low note that trembled faintly through the air, a sound like the ghost of a prayer. "I knew you'd come," he said quietly. "I didn't mean for her to die. She said she'd tell the vicar she always did what was right. But I'd lost too much already. One more shame, one more debt, and I'd be done. So I begged her, and she looked at me as though I were a thief in God's house. I only meant to stop her from crying out." Craddock took a slow step forward. "And when you realized what you'd done, you locked the door, didn't you? Then you posted the letter to make it look like she'd written again later." Pike nodded faintly. "I thought perhaps it would make sense that way, that she'd finished her work." Miss Marple's voice, when it came, was kind. "You did a terrible thing, Mr. Pike. But you see, Emily was not a woman who would ever cry out in anger. She would have forgiven you if you'd let her." He looked up at her then, his eyes wet and hollow. "I know," he whispered. "That's what makes it unbearable." For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the quiet hum of the organ's pipes, still resonating from that single pressed key. Then Craddock moved forward and gently removed Pike's hands from the keyboard. The man rose without resistance, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the candlelight. Outside, the snow had thickened again, swirling soft and pale around the churchyard graves. As they led him out into the night, Miss Marple lingered behind, looking once more at the empty pews, the candles guttering in the draught. The vicar appeared quietly beside her. "It's over then," he said softly. She nodded, though her voice was thoughtful. "Yes, and yet, these things never truly end. The harm lingers like smoke in old stone. It takes years to fade. But truth, when it's finally spoken, has its own kind of mercy." The vicar watched her, gratitude and sorrow mingling in his eyes. "You always see what others miss, Miss Marple." She smiled faintly. "Not always, my dear. But people, you know, are rather like villages. They have their crooked lanes and their hidden corners. You simply have to walk them slowly and listen for what the silence is trying to say." When she stepped back into the cold, the world seemed still again. The snow muffled all sound, softening the edges of grief and guilt alike. She drew her shawl tighter, her small figure moving steadily down the lane toward her cottage, where the lamp still glowed in the window. And behind her, the bell of Mary's tolled once quiet, solemn, and final.